about two rulings on same-sex marriage. You can follow our entire coverage over on C-SPAN 3 with reaction from outside the court, around Capitol Hill, and your calls and tweets. Now to the House.
6th, 2013. I hereby appoint the Honorable Reed J. Ribble to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 3, 2013, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for the morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each, but in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning, Mr. Speaker, I rise to acknowledge the memory and the life of Pearl S. Buck, an author, humanitarian, and political activist who made her home in Hilltown, Bucks County on Green Hills Farm, where she wrote 100 books. During this week, the anniversary of her 121st birthday, we note that Pearl Buck is the first American woman to receive the Nobel Prize and Pulitzer Prize for Literature. A prolific writer, she also advocated on behalf of women's rights and minority groups, while her efforts for the care and adoption of Asian and mixed-race children are legendary. Pearl Buck will be remembered for humanitarian achievements as well as for her writing, and we acknowledge the renovation recently of her 19th century farmhouse in Bucks County, notably a National Historic Landmark that will be sustained for new generations to learn and emulate Pearl Buck's love for the struggling, the misunderstood, and the children. We honor her life and we treasure her memory. I yield back.
The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, after 23 NHL playoff games, 10 overtimes, and 64 goals, the Chicago Blackhawks have won their second Stanley Cup in the last 4 years. Congratulations to the greatest team in hockey on being the 2013 Stanley Cup champions. The impressive regular season began with a record-breaking streak of 24 straight games with a point earned, and it ended with the President's Trophy for the most points in the regular season. This success set the stage for an outstanding playoff run, a promise of things to come. The Hawks made good on that promise this week in one of the most incredible and improbable Stanley Cup final games in NHL history. Having already tamed the Minnesota Wild, taken down our arch-rival, the Detroit Red Wings, and dethroned the Los Angeles Kings, the Blackhawks grinded through the finals to one of the craziest and most exciting Stanley Cup wins ever witnessed. To say this championship-winning game was a nail-biter would be an understatement. The Blackhawks came from behind twice to overcome an amazing effort by the Boston Bruins, scoring 2 goals just 17 seconds apart in the final minute and a half of the game. Unbelievable goals scored by Brian Bickle and Dave Bolin ensured their names will be inscribed forever in the Blackhawk history books as well as on Lord Stanley's Cup. With outstanding efforts by Captain Jonathan Toews, Conn Smythe winner, Buffalo native, Patrick Kane, the best defenseman in hockey, Duncan Keith, and of course the best goalie in the playoffs, Corey Crawford. The entire team made good on a promise that this original 6 team is a true legend to be reckoned with. As I have mentioned before, hockey never left Chicago, but Rocky Wirtz brought it back. The owner of the Blackhawks has once again made our city proud. The entire organization is the classiest in sports, the model in hockey, led by John McDonough, Jay Blunk, Stan Bowman, and Coach Joel Quenneville. They have enshrined Chicago as a hockey town for the 21st century. But the Blackhawks don't just unify our city, they also are committed to serving the community and making it better. Their Street Hawks program has worked to promote fitness and leadership skills to local youth through street hockey initiatives and community skating facilities. Through the NHL's Hockey is for Everyone program, I've had the pleasure of working with the Hawks to expand hockey access to at-risk and LGBT youth, because no matter what your background, every child should have the opportunity to play the greatest sport in the world. The Blackhawks have also been strong supporters of America's veterans and wounded warriors. Just this year, I joined the Hawks and the USA Warriors veterans team for an outdoor hockey game at Soldier Field. The Hawks gave these vets, most of whom are Purple Heart recipients, a once-in-a-lifetime experience they will never forget. And I suppose that this is what the Hawks do best: provide their fans in Chicago and around the world, with memories they will never forget. I look forward to new memories yet to be made during future Stanley Cup victories. Games with Blackhawk players who are just kids right now, with the memory of the shots heard around the hockey world ringing through their heads. Mr. Speaker, hockey is a special sport that brings people together, improves our communities, and most importantly, makes people dream the impossible and do the improbable. The entire world saw this week through the 2013 Stanley Cup champion Chicago Blackhawks. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Go Hawks. And I yield back. And as always, my kind of town Chicago is.
Gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Rogers, for 5 minutes. Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, American coal families are under attack, not from a foreign power or a natural disaster, but by an administration that has resolutely, perversely, and now overtly proposed to end coal mining and coal-fired power generation in these United States. President Obama's calamitous climate change plan, announced yesterday, is the latest job-killing bomb to be dropped on Kentucky, West Virginia, Illinois, dozens of other coal states already knocked down after 4 years of administration policies. This administration has used code words like streamlining and permit reviews to shell our communities with regulations and red tape that even the most sophisticated businesses can't adhere to. Now the White House is dismantling our strategic energy advantage and unilaterally disarming our economy in broad daylight. I quote White House Climate Advisor Daniel Schrage, straight out of the White House, quote, "A war on coal is exactly what's needed," end of quote. Mr. Speaker, a war on coal is exactly what is not needed. A war on coal is a war on middle-class Americans. It's a war on jobs, all kinds of jobs. It's already claimed 5,700 direct Kentucky jobs in just a year and a half. The vast majority of those in my economically challenged district. There is no recovery in Inez or high-tech boom in Harlan, Mr. President. My families are struggling to get back to work, pay their bills, or find salaries comparable to coal mining. And my communities are losing their main employers. This climate plan makes the situation worse, dimming the prospects of reopening the mines even further. Moreover, this disastrous climate change plan is a plan for America's economic and security decline. This plan will only lead to higher electric bills and increased dependence on foreign enemy sources. And to think someone has the audacity to say, we need a war on coal. Well, what we need is a war on that line of thinking. This administration's stringent rules and absurd mandates are simply meant to force coal-fired power plants to stop burning coal or shutter their facilities altogether. I call it strangulation by regulation. Mr. Speaker, more than 200 coal plants have already closed across 25 states, and now 7 new EPA regulations are on track to do even more damage. I'm losing one of the biggest employers in Lawrence County to this onslaught, 1,200 good-paying jobs. In total, the closure of mines, shuttering of power plants, and resulting hikes in electric rates are expected to cost the U.S. economy some 887,000 jobs per year. Please tell me how this is in our national interest, how this is leading America forward. In 2008, the President promised to bankrupt the coal fields, and yesterday he took a giant step toward that reckless, shameful goal. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Israel, for 5 minutes. Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 5 days, the student loan interest rate will double. It will go from 3.4% to 6.8%. That is a $4,500 increase for many college students. At a time when they're struggling to make ends meet, they're struggling to pay their tuition, to pay their housing expenses, to prepare to join the workforce and build careers. At a time when they're struggling to pay their debts, we're going to increase their debt. I want to commend to my colleagues a report from the Joint Economic Committee staff that just came out that talks about how student loan debt has skyrocketed over the past several years. Here's how the study concludes, and I'm quoting, "The increasing debt burden presents challenges for recent graduates just beginning their careers and poses a potential risk to the economy, since individuals who shoulder heavier debt balances may delay purchasing a home, buying a car, starting a family, and saving for retirement. On average, recent graduates left college with student loan debt of 60% of their annual income." Mr. Speaker, 60% of their annual income will be spent paying back their debts from college, and if we don't compromise, it's going to be even more than that. Now, I've always believed, and I know many of my colleagues have always believed, that you build an economy by building the middle class. And you expand the middle class by making sure that middle-class families can afford college, that college is accessible. I do not understand an economic strategy that says that you make it harder and more expensive for the middle class to go to college, nor do I understand an argument that we cannot afford to keep the interest rate low, but we can spend $40 billion subsidizing the 5 richest oil companies in America who do not need those subsidies. The middle class deserves those subsidies. Middle-class students trying to get into college to begin careers deserve subsidies. But to say that they cannot have those subsidies, that we're going to double the interest rate on them while preserving a $40 billion subsidy to the richest oil companies on earth, is not only bad policy, it's ruinous economic strategy. Mr. Speaker, I do not know why anybody in this body would want to make it harder and more difficult for students to go to college at a time when we are competing with China and South Korea and other countries around the world to continue our strength and power over the next several decades. It is essential that we find a compromise, Mr. Speaker. There is an unquenchable thirst by Americans for compromise in this body. I, for one, and members of the House Democratic Caucus are ready, willing, and able to compromise over the next 5 days. We just need somebody to compromise with. And we need a compromise that is fair to the middle class, puts middle-class families first, puts college students first, puts college affordability first, and puts partisan politics aside. I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, a great deal has been said about the border surge over in the Senate. And in typical Senate think, they have seen a problem and have decided to throw money at the problem, even if a lack of funding is not the problem in which they are facing. This map divides the country up into the Border Patrol sections. The numbers are from 1920. The numbers are different, or 2010. The numbers are different today, but obviously the ratios are about the same. In this year, one has to ask the question of why were 56 illegal entries apprehended in the main sector and 200,000 apprehended in the Arizona sector. What was the difference between those two? Look, if you were trying to sneak into a baseball game, something I'm not advocating, but if you were to try to do that, you don't jump over the turnstile where a cop is standing. You go around the corner and find the hole in the fence where no one will actually see what you're doing. The drug cartels are not stupid. They are looking for that hole in the fence. And obviously in this sector is where the majority of the illegals and the illegal drugs and the illegal human trafficking and potential of terrorism exists. So the question has to be, why is that the entrance level of choice? And it's actually very simple. This map, everything that is red is land that's owned by the federal government. In Arizona, 80% of the border is owned by the federal government. Over half of that is in wilderness category, endangered species, or conservation habitat category, where by special law, the legislation provides this land a special status which prohibits the Border Patrol from entering that area. They can't enter in a motorized vehicle. They can't even pedal a bicycle. They can go into that area by foot or on specially fed horses, and that is it. The drug cartel recognizes why this is there. They're not stupid, and they realize that this is the problem. When this Congress insisted a fence be built along the California border, we passed legislation that waived 40 environmental laws that were prohibiting the fence from being built. Those same 40 laws are the laws that prohibit the Border Patrol from going along the red areas of that border and doing their job, which simply means, as ironic as it sounds, federal law is stopping the federal Border Patrol from going on federal land to do a federal purpose, which is federally stupid. But that is indeed what we're doing it. The Border Patrol is actually the ones that care about the environment. Drug cartels don't at all. This cacti, which was cut down by the drug cartel, is an endangered species. And it was cut down there to stop east-west access on the only road that is allowed the Border Patrol to follow in that particular area. This truck Thank you, Vanna White. This truck is a temporary sensor device in a wilderness area. The Border Patrol wanted to move it from point A to point B. It took them 6 months to get approval by the land manager in that area before they could back the truck up and move the truck over to another step, because the land manager was not happy with the Border Patrol being in his wilderness territory. And the law was on the side of the land manager, not on the side of the Border Patrol. Like, the Senate has tried to say that they are coming up with a compromise solution to increase border security. In actuality, they have done just the opposite. They have put language in there that says Homeland Security Secretary can, notwithstanding any other law, require certain elements to be built in this particular area. But that allows the Secretary of the Homeland Security to have the political discretion on whether to do it or not. It allows the Secretary of Homeland Security to have immediate access into these border areas, but only in Arizona. If they go anywhere else along this border, they have to have the written approval of the Secretary of Interior as well as the Secretary of Agriculture. And most importantly, it says in there that the manner in which the Homeland Secretary shall make these decisions must be in the manner that best protects the natural and cultural resources on federal land. I'm sorry, as soon as they have put that language in there, it requires some bureaucrat to establish what the standard is, and it opens it up to someone else having litigation that that is not the best standard possible. In essence, we're back in a worse situation. They wish to have another 20,000 Border Patrol agents. But this is what our fence looks like in Arizona today. Simply, this is a fence, this is Mexico, that's Arizona, and the open area is the animal habitat to allow animals to go back forth from Mexico and Arizona. The one road on here is the only road in which the Border Patrol is allowed to go. You can have another 20,000, you can have another 100,000 agents on that area, and you will simply find out that it still won't help unless you let them go outside of that one road. We don't need more money, we need access. What the Senate is proposing is actually worse than the status quo, and with that I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the impacts of climate change can no longer be denied. Superstorm hurricanes, massive tornadoes, record-breaking droughts and heat spells, accelerating melting of glaciers, and increasing ocean salinity. Due to the effects of climate change, many highly populated communities at low elevations face increasing pressure from storms and rising waters, potentially driving massive migrations to higher ground. If we continue on this path, extensive and severe droughts will hurt food production and freshwater supplies in the United States. Similar occurrences around the world will certainly be destabilizing and potentially draw the United States into dangerous conflicts. Most climate change models predict increasing severity of these and other effects. However, the reality is that most computer models are being outpaced as the carbon buildup and energy trapped in the atmosphere accelerates. Despite these developments, there is an increasing partisan divide on the issue of climate change. Many of my Republican colleagues are either in complete denial that global warming is happening, don't believe human activity is causing the problem, or think that it would be too expensive to take the necessary steps to mitigate and adapt to global warming. This gross partisan behavior in denial of science is becoming a clear and present threat to our national security and well-being. Would we sit by if a foreign power built up a threatening military force on one of our borders? Of course not. And yet, climate change presents a threat that's just as dangerous. So what will it take for this nation to greatly reduce carbon we are adding to the atmosphere and begin the process of preparing for the changes that are coming? Will it take a global weather catastrophe? Will it take several more Hurricane Sandys? How many years of drought will the Midwest be forced to endure? With global warming, the signs of change are overwhelming. We cannot wait for a global catastrophe that will impose massive suffering enough to overcome our civil institutions. Our national security depends on us taking action now. The good news is that if we do take action now, the cost is affordable and the benefits are significant. Even if climate change were not a threat, reducing our consumption of fossil fuels will make the environment cleaner and energy costs less volatile. Increasing energy efficiency will greatly reduce family utility bills while making our homes more comfortable. Using renewable energy creates stable jobs. On the other hand, if we wait until a global or regional climate catastrophe forces desperate action, the consequences will be expensive and possibly deadly. Those who reject science and deny human-caused climate change are fostering a dangerous threat to our nation's future and to future generations of all Americans. I hope that those who deny the effects of climate change see the danger that they are subjecting our nation to, or that the voters elect representatives who will take the responsible actions necessary to address the imminent threat of climate change. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The West Fork Fire Complex. Acreage burning now in Colorado. More than 141 square miles and counting. The East Peak Fire, over 13,000 acres and counting. These are just two of the fires that are burning in my district now, and it is still early summer. Tens of thousands of acres of forests have already gone, and entire communities are being threatened. Brave men and women are working around the clock to be able to stop this devastation. They're truly incredible. and I want to thank all of them for all they are doing to be able to protect property, save lives, and to be able to contain these wildfires. Just like the wildfires that have ravaged our state over the past decade, these fires have destroyed property and are doing irreversible damage to the environment, to the fragile ecologies and watersheds on which we rely. The incident commanders in charge of the suppression efforts on the West Fork fire, the nation's highest priority, told me this week that the behavior of the fire is unprecedented. Because of all of the beetle-killed timber, unnaturally dense forests, and dry conditions, the fire has acted in a way that defies computer models and has been incredibly devastating. The most tragic part of all of this is the occurrence of these forest fires could be reduced, if not outright prevented, with common sense, healthy forest management. With this in mind, I have put forward the following resolution, expressing the House of the Representatives that allocating the appropriate resources to wildland fire management is needed to protect the environment, the economy, the people of the United States, and for other purposes. Whereas the thoughts and prayers of the members of the House of Representatives go out to the individuals and families who have lost loved ones and their homes to wildfire, whereas the members of the House of Representatives express the utmost gratitude to wildland firefighters, first responders who bravely protect life and property, whereas nearly 10 million acres of land burned in the United States in 2012, whereas the acreage burned by wildfires has steadily increased over the past decade, whereas the most destructive fire in the history of the state of Colorado and the largest fire in the history of the state of New Mexico destroyed hundreds of homes and hundreds of thousands of acres of wildlife habitat in 2012, whereas the federal management of our forests and land management officials continue to request fewer funds to fight wildfires, whereas the funding available for wildland fire suppression in the wildland fire management account of the Forest Service was cut by $461 million from fiscal year 2011 to fiscal year 2013, whereas the wildland fire hazardous fuels reduction account of the Forest Service was cut by $22 million from fiscal year 2011 to fiscal year 2013, and the latest budget request asks for another $116 million decrease, whereas the Collaborative Forest Restoration Program, a program that benefits local economies and improves the overall health of the landscape, has taken a 20% cut in funding over the past 2 years, whereas senior Forest Service officials have described a federal land management system hamstrung by analysis of paralysis, whereas decades of federal mismanagement have increased fuel loads on federal forest land and led to increased risk of catastrophic wildfire, whereas the U.S. Forest Service has replaced responsible, environmentally sound timber thinning with allowing forests to burn through overcrowded forests, whereas the bark beetle epidemic has destroyed 40 million acres of forests in North America, and whereas academic studies indicate that the bark beetle-infected trees can still be salvaged for timber to be used for mills and to contribute to small businesses and local economies, now therefore be it resolved that it is the sense of the House of Representatives that allocating appropriate resources to wildland fire management is needed to protect the environment, the economy, and the people of the United States. The bravery of the men and women who risk their lives to extinguish these conflagrations can never be questioned. A healthy forest policy must include prescribed thinning. Funding to fight and prevent wildfires is essential to public safety, environmental protection, and economic growth. People who live in or near our national forests have a right to expect the greatest possible protection for their homes and properties. The government should not continue to acquire more land when it mismanages the hundreds of millions of acres already controlled by the government are mismanaged, and the Forest Service should proactively manage federal forest lands in a manner that protects life and property, prevents catastrophic wildfire, promotes forest and watershed health, and creates jobs and economic development in the forest products industry. I invite all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join with me in standing with the people of Colorado, standing with all in the West who have been impacted by catastrophic wildfire. Join me in thanking the firefighters who are risking their lives to protect others. Join me in the action to prevent future devastation and restore our forests to health. And with that, I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minutes ago, a 5-4 decision written by Justice Kennedy ruled that DOMA is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. Today's decision is a monumental step forward in the long march towards GLBT equality. 40 years ago, I chaired a committee hearing in the Oregon legislature on discrimination based on sexual orientation. It was an eye-opening experience to me. It was the first time someone ever acknowledged to me their sexual orientation, let alone the discrimination they faced living a life of repression and fear. In the course of those 40 years, it's been a privilege to have been able to help fight to ban discrimination based on sexual orientation. We've watched a political movement emerge from the ashes of defeat of discriminatory ballot measures across the country. It's exciting to see how this movement has been led at first by the people in the GLBT community who refuse to accept defeat, who, despite significant personal sacrifice, have stepped forward to declare who they are, who they love, what they want, and why they want it. It's been encouraging to watch business leaders step forward, no longer just the more progressive elements of the business community. Lately, it's become mainstream to acknowledge that diversity in the workforce demands a non-discrimination policy, that regardless of a person's sexual orientation and to whom they choose to commit, it makes no difference in the eyes of a thoughtful, successful employer. It's exciting for me to watch and participate in this year's Pride Parade in Portland, to note the leadership of virtually every institution in our community, businesses like Nike and Standard Insurance, Northwest Natural, grocery stores, colleges and universities, churches, all marching proudly in a show of solidarity, a rejection of discrimination, support for the diversity in the workplace for our friends, neighbors, and relatives. Today's Supreme Court decision marks the most significant milestone yet in this struggle. By striking down DOMA, the Supreme Court has cast aside a major barrier to our GLBT friends and neighbors and relatives to be able to live complete lives, to be able to avoid discrimination, the stigma, the economic disadvantage. It's a signal that this will be the final chapter for a society that recognizes the worth of all human beings, acknowledges the right of all human beings to live as they wish, love who they will, and be able to enjoy the multiple benefits that come from being involved with committed relationships and legal marriages. It's not just a milestone for our brothers and sisters in the GLBT community. It's a significant benefit for all society. If one truly believes that marriage is one of the cornerstones that we encourage for committed relationships, for people to be able to raise their families, look after one another in a stable, committed relationship, you know, why shouldn't they be able to marry? Why should the federal government refuse to recognize that and discriminate? Some of the most traditional elements of our society who are dragging their feet should be in the forefront, helping lead this charge. Now, we must be vigilant. There are still pockets of resistance, hostility, bigotry, and discrimination. There are state laws that need to be adjusted, but it will no longer be sanctioned by federal policy. And that is a critical difference. Once it is no longer legal to discriminate, we're truly in the home stretch for the type of society we want. This critical step was a narrow 5-4 decision, but it was a victory nonetheless. The path forward is a little more clear, and it's going to be a little easier. But before we start this next chapter, it's fitting that we celebrate this moment, the accomplishment of what it represents, and what it will mean for America. That temple of justice that is the Supreme Court looks a little different this morning, and I hope Americans will appreciate it and think about where we go from here. Thank you. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until noon today.
The House will return for legislative work at noon Eastern, at which point members will take up rules for debate on 3 bills. 2 are offshore oil and gas drilling bills, including one dealing with drilling along the U.S.-Mexico maritime boundary in the Gulf of Mexico. The third deals with funding the Agriculture Department for 2014. Live coverage of the House when members return at noon Eastern here on C-SPAN. The Supreme Court